Hello, I'm very pleased to be with you this morning, and I'm very pleased to be able to present the database that was implemented by INED, which is called the Demographics of Death by COVID. And this database was implemented at the end of March. We had been locked down for not even 2 weeks at that time. And during our discussions, we highlighted two major questions. That is, we have to assess the quality of the daily count of deaths that was used to monitor the development of the pandemic. As a demographer, we saw figures that were published. I don't know whether you remember that in March there were less deaths, and this led to lots of comments in the media. And then there were international comparisons as well, that is to see what the comparison was between data from one country to the other. And in this discussion we had 7 points that concerned us. These are points of vigilance, and this is how we were able to build the first version of the website. And it's the architecture that you find today is not the same, it changed. And so these concerns, the concerns we were thinking about, were really the concerns from the end of March to the beginning of April. And so here we wanted to know exactly when the deaths took place. We didn't know whether the death recorded was the date, whether the date was the date recorded or the date communicated by a military agency, for example. There were also significant questions around the place of death. The deaths took place right across the country. Was this all of the deaths, or just deaths that took place in hospitals? And how do we know that these were deaths due to COVID? What was the procedure? What were the rules? Another significant concern throughout April was to define a date for the beginning of the epidemic. How do we compare the epidemics between the different countries? And associated with this question was the question of assessing the dynamic of the evolution, or the evolution. As you may remember, at the beginning of the epidemic, there were big questions around whether the epidemic would slow down, whether it would speed up, or whether it would plateau, etc. And then we spoke a lot about clusters. You'll remember there were a number of clusters in France, and you remember that there was a health public measure, 3 stages. We were stage 1. Stage 2 was when the virus entered France, and at that time we would identify clusters, etc. And so we had questions about the geographical scale. What scale should we work on? Does it make sense recording deaths at the level of the country and reporting it to the entire population if the deaths are only concentrated in the east of France? So how can we compare Italy with China, for example? So there were those issues as it relates to geographical scale. And then, of course, as a demographer, we were also preoccupied by whether we had the right information as it relates to the age of the person that died. Was it a man or woman, for example? So very quickly we saw that a way to resolve these questions was to structure the database and to know exactly what was recorded, what was counted. And the first characteristic, the first feature of our database, if we were to compare it to others, is that ours is a database of metadata. That means that it's a place where we can find files that explain what is counted, what is counted by each country, what is counted by Santé Publique France, for example, and its equivalents in Italy, Spain, or elsewhere. Whereas in the other databases that we have access to, there is a figure, but there is no information around what these figures mean and how they were collected. And then on the other significant feature of this database is that the figures that you find in this database are figures that are distinguished by gender, age, and place of death. And these are structuring values in the field of demographics. And that's quite rare because most large international websites only publish totals, the total number of deaths, the evolution of the total number of deaths with variations according to departments, etc. But there's very little information on the gender ratio, the structure by age, and even less information on the place of death. And articles have been published recently that try to cover COVID mortality at the international level. So that's roughly 70 countries or so. So it's not all countries, but as soon as we must distribute the information by gender or age, there are no more than 30 countries. And INED's website gives valuable information for 21 countries, and we are going to very quickly, I imagine, have 30 countries that have this information broke down by sex and age, gender and age, underpinned by metadata, and this will be available on INED's website. So these are the graphs that we can see on the website, but they, as you see, are from April and March 2020 and highlight what our concerns were. That is to say, how can we document all of these peaks of the epidemic? We had to invent a time, that is to say, to understand and identify the first day of the epidemic for each of the countries. You see here that we have logarithmic scales on this graph, which means that we were very much interested in the slowing of the epidemic, or just the evolution of these curves. And we have daily information because on a day-to-day basis we were examining what was happening. So this enabled us to see where there were regularities or irregularities. So here, for example, in April 2020, I don't know if you can see this, but there are some triangles and on the graph. And what these shapes show you are Sundays. What we saw was that systematically there was a dip in the number of deaths declared on Sundays. Now, no one does this. Everyone provides figures, an average over the 7 days. And this means that it gives a better idea of the epidemic, and this is the result. So here we did not understand at the time where we were going, but we knew that there would be different waves. And now what is important indeed is to be able to summarize the wave, and so the information is information that is given for a period of 7 days. It's no longer daily. And now if we want to compare the different countries and we want to try the major factors globally as it relates to seasonality or pollution, etc., then we can now compare the waves. In a more evident way. What we still do not understand is how the wave returns. And so what we do is we match up all of the countries and we try to see what triggers the return of a wave. Is it pollution? Is it a season? Is it a particular climate? So we try to look here for meta factors. So these waves over time, and you can see here at the beginning, perhaps you can't see this, but I chose graphs from a number of websites that cover different countries of the world, and here you have 18 countries, and I did this too. So we have Belgium, France, Italy, United Kingdom, Switzerland. We can see that at the beginning of the epidemic, the first wave happened at the same time in these countries, but after a while the waves dispersed and the dynamic was increasingly unclear from one country to the next. And when we see these waves now, we can't say clearly that there was an alignment of the waves in the north hemisphere or the southern hemisphere. For the moment, we do not understand the dynamic of these waves, which is great for a researcher because it means that we have work to do. Now, for these information systems, as a way to help govern and manage COVID-19, and that's the aim of my presentation, we saw that there was an enormous risk of biases relating to three different factors. So the place of death. Are the monitoring systems biased? Are they fair? Do they indicate clearly and accurately where the death took place? Does it cover both genders, and do we have information for all ages? And so here we have an example from France with the main IT system that we know, and this is the day-to-day count, the average over 7 days of deaths due to COVID in hospitals. And so the hospitals are well monitored in France, but are we monitoring all deaths in France? Do we have a vision that is not biased of mortality in France as it relates to these three different factors? And so here we see that it is biased, because if we just look at deaths in hospitals, then we see that a significant proportion is missing, and that is the deaths that took place in retirement homes. And here, what we see here, this is not information that comes from the government. This is governmental information, excuse me. And what we see here is that the death rate, or information about the death rates in retirement homes, was not really collated until after the first peak of the epidemic. The state agencies that had to develop IT systems had to work speedily and had to come up with a system, and that means that for deaths in retirement homes, we only had a total number. So we know how many died in retirement homes, but we don't know what their gender was or how old they were. We only have a total number of deaths. What's interesting on this graph here is, and we can see it very clearly here, on the 1st of January 2020, we can see the total disappearance of deaths in retirement homes as vaccination progressed. That's January 2021. And the second graph gives you exactly the same information. However, this information is not from the monitoring system. It's from regular statistics of the cause of death. And this is really the gold standard. Except that statistics in France, well, in France at least, you have to wait 3 months to be able to get the latest available figures for deaths. So in general, those figures are deaths that occurred at least 3 months prior, and obviously that's not acceptable if you want to manage a pandemic. And so here we can see clearly what happened. We can see the beginning of the pandemic and of deaths due to COVID in retirement homes. We can also see very finite things in this information. So we see the number of deaths right across the population and specific deaths in retirement homes. We can also see information about deaths at home. And those deaths were not monitored in the monitoring system. Obviously, if I will just go back one slide, if the information that we have to combat COVID-19 is just information based on deaths in hospitals, even if that information is broken down by age and sex, and INED is the only person that was able, the only body doing this, then we know, because in retirement homes, the population in retirement homes is mainly made up of elderly women. Therefore, if we don't see what deaths are happening in the retirement homes, then we're going to bias, we're going to skew the representation of deaths due to COVID, and this is going to lead to an exaggeration of deaths linked to COVID for men, and this means that there will be an excessive recording of older ages. So over 95. So those deaths will be missing, and a number of female deaths will be missing as well. But this is the real structure here. This is the structure that we can calculate based on the death certificates received by INSERM. But this information is only provided 3 months after the death occurred. Therefore, it cannot help with coordinating the response to COVID. Now, I just want to show you our database. So you have a map and you click on the country that you're interested in, and it provides you with metadata from that particular country. And if you click on France, you can see the data from the monitoring system and our database system, and this enables you to compare both sources. But as you see, there isn't just France, so there are other countries as well. So let's use Sweden as an example. Well, in Sweden, that we have a monitoring system. There is a monitoring system which is called Suminect, which is managed by the public health agency in Sweden. It's not similar to the one that we have in France. Their monitoring system is based on or relies on a biological laboratory, and in Sweden there are 50 of those labs that are certified labs, and those biology labs will provide information about people who test positive for COVID. In France, we provide statistics on a day-to-day basis. We have figures related to the number of people who test positive for COVID during the day. In Sweden, this is directly connected to statistics as it relates to death. And in Sweden, it's very simple. That is to say, every person who is tested positive for COVID who dies within 30 days, that death is directly recorded in the National Death Registry, and they are considered as having died from COVID. And in addition to this, in France, we have a regular statistic as it relates to the cause of death, and this is provided by the National Council for Health and Wellbeing. And so that we have two different bodies. And what's interesting is that we can compare, as I've just done for France, between the data from Santé Publique France and from INSERM, we can compare the same thing, but in Sweden. And here you can see that if we do it in Sweden, you can see that the monitoring system is completely different in Sweden. The data from the monitoring system is indicated here by the little red dots, and the little red dots are the number of deaths that are defined as being individuals who tested positive for COVID and who died 30 days following that positive test. And we see in blue death certificates that are filled in by doctors that relate to or that pertain to deaths due to COVID. And that is to say that COVID was the main cause of death. And we can see very clearly here that the monitoring is effective and has the three main criteria. The timing is perfect, the monitoring data gives the right timing, it gives the right dynamic, and also indicates the right intensity. There are no faults here, in fact. So it's just to demonstrate you that there are other systems that aren't built out like the French system, but there are systems that don't rely on hospitals, but that have been able to represent all deaths due to COVID within the country. And so all of this was done using the data from the website, and all of this is to say that our website, and it's not necessarily what we wanted to do in the beginning, but our website is not an instrument that can be used to fight COVID. However, it is a database which I believe is a rich database and quite incredible, and it's the only database that enables to measure the quality and the strengths and the weaknesses of the different monitoring systems that have been implemented in the 21 countries that took part in this database. And in many cases, I'm thinking of Italy and Spain, etc. We can significantly improve monitoring, but for this we need all the information, and that information is found in this database. And therefore, I hope that it will become increasingly useful in terms of fighting COVID. But as you can see, we can use it to better prepare ourselves and to do better the next time. Thank you very much for your attention.